welcome back to Off the Deep Path. I'm your host, Stan Deep, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of June 18, 2026. We are coming to you once again from the semi-quincentennial division here at the Georgia Historical Society as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States this year. And today we're doing something a little bit different. As you know, long-suffering listeners of this podcast will know that usually when I talk about a book on here, I usually, almost always, have the author on here as well. And we have what I hope is a lively discussion about the ideas in the book. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. I am joined by GHS President and CEO and my good friend Todd Groce to talk about a book that is an American history classic, but whose author is long dead. I'm talking about Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s book, The Imperial Presidency, first published in 1973. Now, the way this came about, a month or so ago, Todd found a copy of this book in a used bookstore, and he asked me in passing had I ever read it. I had not. I have very long been familiar with Schlesinger, who is one of the most prominent historians of the 20th century, but I had never read this book. The term Imperial Presidency has come to sort of define what the presidency is all about since really World War II, and I think Schlesinger is to thank for that. Todd and I have spent a lot of time over the past almost 3 decades as we've worked together discussing the books that we read, and I have to add much to the chagrin of my colleagues who have often had to listen to it, but I hope to the credit and benefit of the Georgia Historical Society as we do much of our work in public history here. But as we began to, I ordered a copy myself, and I said, Todd, why don't we have a podcast about this and share the conversation, our conversation back and forth about this book with a larger audience? I mean, why keep the suffering in-house when we can spread it around? But I hope that you will enjoy our conversation about this. And what I hope is the first of many conversations to come, not just with Todd, but with other historians about classics in American history with authors who are by authors who are no longer around. Now, Arthur Bancroft Schlesinger, as he was known when he was born on October 15th, 1917 in Columbus, Ohio. He was there because his father, Arthur Meyer Schlesinger, was a historian teaching at Ohio State. From his mid-teens, the younger Arthur called himself Arthur Meyer Schlesinger, Jr. He was named, of course, for George Bancroft, a famous 19th century historian, but he didn't keep that name. He went to Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire and then Harvard, graduating at the age of 20, never earned a Ph.D. During World War II, he failed his military medical exam and instead served in the Office of War Information. From 1943 to 1945, he served as an intelligence analyst in the Office of Strategic Services, which was, of course, the precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. He went back into academia after the war from 1946 to 1954. He taught at Harvard. He was active in the 1952 presidential campaign, serving as the primary speechwriter for Democratic nominee, unsuccessful Democratic nominee, Adlai Stevenson, who, of course, lost to Dwight Eisenhower. 4 years later, he served again in 1956 in the Stevenson campaign, this time alongside Robert F. Kennedy. Now, Schlesinger had known his older brother John Kennedy since Harvard days, and in 1960, he supported JFK's run for the presidency and authored a book entitled, Arthur authored a book entitled Kennedy or Nixon, Does It Matter? JFK offered him a place in his administration, and he served as special assistant to the president, sort of a roving ambassador and troubleshooter, advising the president on policy, particularly in Latin America, and was also a speechwriter. He resigned that position after JFK's assassination. He resigned in January 1964. He returned to teaching in 1966 as the Albert Schweitzer Professor of the Humanities at the City University of New York's Graduate Center, retiring in 1994. Now, Arthur Schlesinger, besides the Imperial Presidency, wrote a host of other very prominent and popular and good books of American history. I'll hit the highlights. He published The Age of Jackson, that is Andrew Jackson, in 1945, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1946. He published The Vital Center, The Politics of Freedom, published in 1949. Between 1957 and 1960, he published a 3-volume history of what he called the Age of Roosevelt, covering the years 1919 to 1936. The three volumes were The Crisis of the Old Order, which won the Bancroft and Parkman prizes, The Coming of the New Deal, and The Politics of Upheaval. Following JFK's assassination, he published a book entitled 1,000 Days, John F. Kennedy in the White House. He published that in 1965. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1966 and the National Book Award in History and Biography. In 1978, he published Robert Kennedy and His Times, which won the 1979 National Book Award in Biography. In 1986, he published The Cycles of American History, and he published various other books right up until his death on February 28th, 2007, at the age of 89. He is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, the Imperial Presidency, as I mentioned, was published in November 1973. It was a finalist for the 1974 National Book Awards for Contemporary Affairs. It was reissued in 1989 with a 79-page epilogue and re-released in 2004 with a new 16-page introduction, including commentary on President George W. Bush and the 2003 Iraq War. As you might imagine, he was very condemnatory of that war, said it wasn't necessary. Now, he began writing the Imperial Presidency in March 1973 after Nixon's November 1972 re-election, and just as Watergate was escalating. Now, I mentioned the book came out in November 1973. That, of course, was 9 months before Nixon's resignation. So that event, which in some ways is foretold in this book, was still months in the future. It was reviewed in the New York Times on November 18th, 1973 by Gary Wills. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what this book is about. This comes from a 50-year retrospective published online by the Cambridge University Press entitled The Emperor is Dead, Long Live the Empire, the Enduring Legacy of the Imperial Presidency. And it said the Imperial Presidency has a basic thesis that is easy to understand. Over time, beginning with the World War II era and accelerating rapidly in the early Cold War, the presidency sidelined Congress from its constitutionally defined role in foreign policy and military affairs, particularly the latter. Before the 1940s, the White House and Congress had sometimes bickered, but mostly respected each other's prerogatives and did not overstep constitutional boundaries. There were exceptions, of course, and in some periods, either the president or Congress might dominate, but on the whole, the system worked. Things broke down in World War II, not because FDR had an imperial disposition, but because of the unprecedented nature of the world crisis, coinciding with congressional isolationism, forcing FDR to experiment, much as Abraham Lincoln had done during the Civil War. In normal times, such as after the Civil War, executive war powers usually snapped back into place. But the globally existential challenges posed by Japan and Germany, and then during the Cold War by the Soviet Union and China, ensured that the presidency, the executive branch, remained supreme in the conduct of war and diplomacy. All of this, of course, came to a head during the Vietnam War, which was an undeclared war, and Schlesinger spends a great deal of time on it, and, of course, the Nixon presidency up to 1973 as well. Schlesinger never planned to write a book on the growth of presidential power. In 1973, he was actually working on his Robert F. Kennedy biography, which wouldn't come out, as I mentioned, for another 5 years. But with the unending nature of the Vietnam War and the unfolding Watergate scandal, he resolved, as Cambridge says, to ring the national alarm bell. Schlesinger began work on this book in 1973, what he thought was going to be a pamphlet, and 5 months and 200,000 words later, he had a major book of over 500 pages, published just 3 months later in November 1973, and it was hailed as an instant classic. It was reviewed favorably in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, as I mentioned, by Gary Wills. Both reviewers on the right and the left gave it really good reviews, and that term, the Imperial Presidency, has come into the American lexicon. As you will, I think, hear in this conversation between Todd and myself, this book still has a lot to say to the American people, some of it very prescient, absolutely still very relevant. And I think we would both highly commend it to everyone who sort of wants to understand the American presidency post World War II. So, with all of that being said, I hope you enjoy what I hope is the first of many conversations like this, where I will sit down with a historian to talk about a classic book published in American history whose author is no longer around. My conversation with Todd Groce about the Imperial Presidency begins now. Dr. Groce, Todd, welcome to our podcast again.
Dr. Deaton, Stan, thank you for having me.
We're talking about Arthur Schlesinger's seminal work, The Imperial Presidency, which, as I have told our audience, was written in 1973, which was probably mid-career for Schlesinger. In between his service on the Kennedy administration, he had already been at the City University of New York for about 7 years at that point. And he's writing this in 1973 after Richard Nixon's reelection in 1972. The Vietnam War is still going on. Watergate as a scandal has broken. But I'll start out by asking you, first of all, what drew you to this book in the first place and that got both of us to read it? And what do you think Schlesinger was trying to do exactly?
Well, what drew me to this book initially was the fact that I had seen it multiple times and the title of it intrigued me. I had never actually taken the time to read it, though, and taken the time to order it. And I thought this is a 50 something plus year old book. It should be interesting to read. It'll give me some idea of what that time period looked like, but probably won't have much bearing on the present because it's a 50 plus year old book.
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw it was in Camden, South Carolina at a bookstore there and happened to see a relatively clean, actually pristine copy for a small amount of money and decided that maybe it was time to buy the book. I pulled it down. I just opened it up, started flipping through it, and was actually astounded that it addressed so many of the issues that we're dealing with right now, issues that are in the headlines right now. Of course, what it made me realize was that this whole question of presidential power and of the acquiring of power and the usurpation of power is something that really has been going on since the beginning because of the way that the Constitution had set up the balance of power, and you've got Congress and the president basically at odds with each other. And so you've got this tension going on between the two of them. And one of them is granted the power to basically defend the country if we're attacked without having permission from Congress. The other, though, reserves to itself the power to declare war, which is very different of launching of a war. So this, what I could see by looking through this book was that this was a theme that was basically present throughout the history of the Republic, and that what we are living through right now was not particularly a sort of unique circumstance, but something that was going on for a very long time now. It's a common theme.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Schlesinger had served in John F. Kennedy's administration. I made a point of that in my introduction. Special assistant to the president. He witnessed the Cuban Missile Crisis up close. He thought Kennedy handled that beautifully. Kennedy, of course, was there when the Vietnam War started, although one can argue it really began under Eisenhower, if you will. But he's basically reacting against, there's no getting around it. Schlesinger is reacting against the presidency of Richard Nixon.
Well, but also I would say Lyndon Johnson as well.
Yeah.
Because and I mean when you look back, and I don't think that certainly Schlesinger, he likes Kennedy. Kennedy probably gets less coverage in here than any of the modern presidents by his standard leading up to Nixon. But he holds Truman and LBJ accountable for really getting to the point where Nixon is able to do what he can do. Nixon can't do what he does without the usurpation of power that takes place under Truman's administration and then that is greatly expanded upon by Lyndon Johnson. So, yes, he's reacting to Nixon, but he's also explaining that Nixon didn't get there on his own. He didn't suddenly just pop up out of nowhere. That this builds upon previous administrations and their actions and their usurpation of power for whatever reason there might be, and we can talk about why that happens.
Hmm.
That particularly at that time period.
Yeah. One of the words that he uses in the book, right in the middle of it, he's talking about presidency and sort of the cult of personalities that grow up around them. We see it in we certainly hear about it in our current president. Of course, most recent presidents, with a few exceptions, had that. I know we heard it about Obama. I don't think we ever heard it about Biden. But the idea that there's this cult-like aura about these people, and he says at one point that as the political parties kind of wasted away, that the president rose up. He says the presidency stood out in solitary majesty as the central focus of political emotion. There were no great personal cults of Rutherford B. Hayes and Benjamin Harrison. Now, voters wanted not only to respect, but to adore their presidents, even when, as in the case of Johnson and Nixon, they found the effort difficult and unrewarding. Now, my question would be, going back to the first president, if any president was going to have a cult around him, it would be George Washington, maybe some of the others like Jefferson, and some would argue they did. But I guess my first question to you is, this cult-like status around presidents didn't start with FDR. I mean, it in some ways does go back, doesn't it? Even if they didn't become imperial presidents in the way that Schlesinger defines.
Well, I think that one of the things he does point out, and we know that as historians, that Congress saw itself as the representative of the people
Mm-hmm.
until Andrew Jackson, who then
Yep.
claimed that he was the only president that had been elected by all the people, and so therefore he was the tribune of the people. Congress didn't buy it. They didn't give up that role easily as being the representative of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what Schlesinger does make a convincing argument that it is this war-making power that these presidents assume, and we can talk about why it happens when it happens. And it's really in that period after World War II and before Korea. That war-making power gives these presidents an aura as commander in chief that they had not had before. That in many ways they become unassailable, that we come to rely more and more on one person, one man, to know what's going on around the world and to keep us safe in a world in which there are constant, ongoing emergencies. Because if you go back to the founding and you go back to Washington and the early republic, all the way up through the Civil War into the into the 20th century, the emergencies existed, powers given to a president during emergency times, but the emergency goes away, and the powers supposedly is also decreases with that. And what happens though after World War II, because of the growth of communism and the threat of that, there's a sense that we are living constantly in an ongoing, everyday emergency, that suddenly this allows the president to accrue power. I think as he points out that Lyndon Johnson played such a big role in this because he says that Lyndon Johnson suddenly took the world and made it seem a lot smaller. Before that, the world had seemed like a big place, and the president didn't have that power to be able to make those kinds of decisions about what might constitute an emergency. But now the world was much smaller because the world now suddenly, the United States could be attacked at any point, and any of our allies now. If they are threatened, that's a threat against the United States. And so the president suddenly gains this enormous power to wage war under the aegis, under the banner of, well, it's an emergency, and we're in a constant emergency. So, yes, there had been, I don't know if we would call them cults, but certainly the strong president had been there. And I think that the founders knew, and certainly it emerged in this way during the 19th century, that strong presidents existed during emergencies. We had to have a strong president to provide leadership. But on the other hand, we had to have a balance of power in order to have liberty.
And I do want. First of all, I was going to say we know that the use of nuclear weapons also factors into this enormously, and we'll come back to that because that's a World War II and then moving forward thing. So going all the way back to the beginning, you mentioned the idea that one man could create could have this much power, could start war, could make decisions that affected entire nations. This is one of the things that I guess the founders in the Constitutional Convention were reacting against because the king had that power. And they did not want, no matter how, and I'll put quotes around this, virtuous the president was, they split up the power, as you said. Presidents were commander in chief, but Congress had the power to declare war. Congress had the power to appropriate money for military defense and otherwise military spending. They very clearly separated those two things out. But almost from the beginning, because of emergencies, as you noted, Washington had to do it in terms of declaring neutrality. By the way, in the great European wars that began after 1793 between France and Britain as a result of the French Revolution, he did what he needed to do as he saw it to protect American interest, and Congress, some even then, questioned whether or not he had the power to do that. So from the very beginning, there's been this tension, despite whatever the founders uh, wrote and whatever they thought, in part because the president has always been the commander in chief, and somehow that also gives him, and to this point, it's just been him, power, right, to create, to start wars, or to fight defensive wars if we're attacked.
And so the story of this book is about how that power grows over time.
Mm-hmm.
The power is there, it's the use of the power. And as you pointed out, I mean, Lincoln himself said that the ability to declare war, one man having that ability to do that, was something that the king had had, and that's something that was characteristic of empires, because empires always have dangers out there on the frontiers. The Romans, there were dangers on the frontier, and so the emperor was able to declare war and to take Rome into war in order to declare that there was an emergency because some barbarian horde was on the rise and some border was being threatened. And then the same thing with the British king. And so I think they on purpose set up that tension. You know, this is one of the things that you and I talk about, this whole misunderstanding that somehow democracy is about unity and everyone getting along. When actually we know that the way the system was set up, it was set up so that there would be constant rivalry between the branches. There would be constant tension. And it was that setting these branches against one another that created the opportunity for that balance of power, which equals the liberty of the people in a democracy. If those branches don't function properly and we get out of balance, that's when we can see our liberty being threatened. And Schlesinger points out multiple times that the ability to wage war, the ability to attack without having Congress's approval, that usurpation of power ultimately allows the president to usurp a power domestically and at home as well. That the use of power for foreign purposes ultimately allows the president to usurp power domestically. And so Schlesinger and many previous writers saw that ability to wage war as being probably the most dangerous power that a president or a leader could have, because it had monarchical tendencies. There was a tendency to ultimately take on power that did not represent the power of the people and to upend the constitutional order.
And there's a lot to unpack there. There seemed to be from the beginning this difference between a defensive war if America were attacked, if presidents had to make decisions, if presidents needed to protect American citizens in foreign places. One of the things I know he talks about is Jefferson's decision to attack the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean or off the coast of Africa. That Congress had always sort of been okay with that. The presidents are often in possession, even in the early years, of information that Congress doesn't have from ambassadors, from people overseas, and therefore he and his cabinet have to make decisions quickly.
I was going to say quick decisions have to be made You can't wait for the process.
Hmm.
And one of the good things about democracy is that it's slow, but then sometimes in these instances, it's also so slow that you can't meet that emergency. So yes, but the idea was that you gave that power that you had gained up when the emergency came to an end.
And he says repeatedly, even when presidents had gone seemingly above and beyond their constitutional powers, they always went back and got Congress's approval, or at least explained to Congress, that is the people's representatives, what they had done and why they had done it. With the idea, I guess, of course, that the people could hold the president accountable at the next election. As we move into this, of course, the whole idea of defensive war is going to change once we get to intercontinental jets and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the idea that you're fighting a defensive war, you may attack somebody on the other side of the globe and say that it's a defensive war. We'll talk about that. But before we get there, I want to talk about something that he mentions right away at the beginning, that Thomas Jefferson was a devotee of John Locke, and he talks repeatedly in this book about something called the Locke Jefferson Lincoln Doctrine. And of course, Lincoln is the most prominent president who, I'm not going to say usurped his power, but certainly went outside of the Constitution in meeting the challenge of the Great Rebellion that was the Civil War. What was the Locke Jefferson Lincoln Doctrine? Can you explain that
Well,
to us?
well, to my limited ability, I will. Um, in essence, what it said, what Locke was trying to say was that emergencies created power, but
Hmm.
that the authentic emergency created exceptions to that power, and that you weren't creating a constitutional precedent by seizing those powers or usurping that power or exercising that power that you would not have outside of an emergency. And as
Hmm.
you pointed out, I mean, Locke talked about this in theory. Jefferson puts it into practice. No one puts it into practice up to that point in the way that Lincoln does, because the whole idea is that, yes, I'm having to go outside of the Constitution, but if I don't, we may not have a Constitution.
Right.
And so the president finds a way to justify his actions so that he can, in essence, save the country. But that also becomes a very dangerous concept later on, because this is where, as Schlesinger points out, this is used by Johnson and Nixon in very different ways than what had been envisioned by Locke, because of that constant idea of every day is an emergency, everywhere there's an emergency. And therefore, I'm able to go and use methods that may be outside of the Constitution in order to meet these emergencies.
Hmm. He quotes Jefferson writing in 1807, on great occasions, every good officer must be ready to risk himself in going beyond the strict line of the law when the public preservation requires it. His motives will be a justification. A strict observance of the written laws is doubtless one of the highest duties of a good citizen, but it is not the highest. The laws of necessity, of self preservation, of saving our country when in danger are of a higher obligation. To lose our country by a scrupulous adherence to written law would be to lose the law itself, with life, liberty, property, and all those who are enjoying them with us, thus absurdly sacrificing the end to the means. Now, that was written in 1810.
And
Obviously, that,
imagine Jefferson saying that while
yeah,
Adams was president.
exactly. Or,
No, not going to happen.
right, right. As he said, power always looks more comfortable within than from without. And Jefferson was the best example of that, of course, starting West Point and then the Louisiana Purchase. But all of that, and to your point, Jefferson writing that, and if we jump ahead and we get into the Cold War, where it seems like the United States, by its very existence, is always facing an existential threat from communism, from communist satellite countries like Vietnam. We must stop it anywhere. We make alliances with people who are otherwise dictators in places like Iran and in Central America because they're not communists. And so, therefore, we begin compromising our moral principles all the way up to the present, where literally everything from immigration to the next election can be a threat of national security. And therefore, a president can quote Jefferson and say the very existence of our country is at stake.
But again, one of the exceptions here, I think, with these presidents was that they knew that they had to. You pointed out just a second ago, they knew that they had to bring the people along with them.
Mm-hmm.
They were not making unilateral decisions that if they did not have public opinion with them, those decisions weren't going to be able to stand. And they kept one eye on this emergency, but they also had one eye on the public. And I love this quote from Schlesinger
Hmm.
talking about Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And he said Roosevelt knew where he wanted to go and where he believed the nation had to go, but he did not want, and this was why he was one of the greatest presidents, he did not want to go there alone. And I think that sums up, at least before Nixon and maybe even LBJ, but certainly Nixon, this idea that you had to bring the people along at some point. Okay, so they don't know what's going on at that moment, but eventually they're going to know through the power of the press. And you've got to make sure that the people are with you, or at least the majority of the people are with you, if you're going to be able to make that stick in some way and not get yourself as president in trouble. So I think
Hmm.
that is a huge, huge difference between what's happening in the 19th century and with Lincoln. I mean, I think in the end, Lincoln knew he was exercising powers that were certainly in peacetime unconstitutional, but he justified it. And then I think he knew also that the majority of the people, certainly in what was left of the United States at that point, that not the states that would have been in rebellion, but the states that were still loyal, that they would be with him and they would support him ultimately in what he was trying to achieve.
So Lincoln has this enormous power. He uses it, of course, to hold the United States together, to bring the rebellious states to heel, and then really the 30 years after that, Congress becomes dominant again. We have even I think with U.S. Grant probably after him, but we have weak presidents right up until Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. Um, were there any instances before we completely leave the 19th century and get on to the much more interesting 20th century? Were there any instances before Lincoln of presidents who felt like they had the power, that they were the tribune of the people, so to speak? Jackson, and I think Polk as well in the Mexican War, felt like that there was only one person in this country elected by all the people. And you mentioned Jackson, but I think Polk felt the same way, right?
He did. So you've got the old Hickory and young Hickory,
Mm-hmm.
Jackson and Polk, both Tennesseans. One is the mentor of the other. Uh, Polk certainly took a lot of his cues from Jackson, and there's always been this controversy around the beginning of the Mexican War. That did Polk actually engineer a crisis in order to provoke the Mexicans in the fighting and to provoke them into attacking American troops so that then he could go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war that would then allow them, assuming that they won, and there were many people who didn't think that the Americans would win because the Mexicans had a much better trained standing army than the Americans did. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion, but Polk believed then if they could win the war, then they could acquire that whole southwestern territory from the Mexicans and expand America from coast to coast and fulfill our manifest destiny, as they said. So there's an instance where, I mean, it really almost smacks of the Gulf of Tonkin.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this manufactured crisis in which Polk feels like he knows best and knows better. And but again, he brings the people along, whether it's based on the truth of what happened or not. He still reaches out and brings the people with him. And there's that constant, again, going back to the people. And I think Jackson understood that. Lincoln understood that. Of course, you mentioned what happens afterwards and after the Civil War. Certainly no emergency on that level. And Congress reasserts its authority and checks the power of the president, reins the president in. Andrew Johnson is reined in. Um, Grant certainly exercises domestic power because you've got an emergency with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the attempt to use methods outside of the law in order to subvert elections, overthrow elections. But you're not going to see that kind of emergency again until you get to the very end of the 19th century, and then even into World War I. And certainly Woodrow Wilson believed in exercising this power. There's a place in there where Schlesinger refers, and I can't remember who he's quoting, but the metaphor stuck with me that this whole idea of taking power from Congress, of usurping the power, that when the president does that, that basically is like a football player with a football, and you just run as far as you can until you get tackled.
Yeah, right. At the end, he says that presidents traditionally are like the man with the football. Once they've got that power, they're going to keep it until somebody brings them down. Somebody
Yeah, they're
tackles
going
them.
to run
Yeah.
with it.
Yep.
So again, I think this, as we've talked about this, we've touched on it multiple times. Presidents, they're always going to push the boundaries. They're always going to seek to expand their power. The question is, will Congress and the courts check that in order to maintain the balance and that separation? Which again, and I've said this several times, but let me just reiterate it. What's important about the separation of powers is that that's one of the safeguards of our liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we get into the 20th century, I mean, the question I think is now it's sort of like, well, if this is not what the founders intended, then how did this happen? Was it just strong individuals who decided that they were president and they could do whatever they wanted to? Was it great emergencies? And as we move into the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, used the power of the presidency to bust up the monopolies, the trust that he thought threatened America's economic interest. Woodrow Wilson is sometimes, of course, seen as this powerful president, but he still asked Congress for a declaration of war before he did anything in terms of sending troops and getting involved. Um, but it's really, of course, it's no secret. It's an isolationist Congress in the 1930s that meets this great crisis that became World War II. And FDR, who, of course, is trying to reshape the economic life of the United States in the Great Depression, who runs for a third term in 1940. He can see what's happening in Europe. He knows America is going to get involved in one way or another that finally reshapes to the point, and this is where I'll hand it off to you, where Schlesinger says during World War II, FDR preferred the title Commander in Chief rather than Mr. President. And it's really at that point forward that one could argue the presidency never went back, never looked back at that point. So,
Well, because as Schlesinger says, and it's an interesting argument, that Congress failed. Congress during the 1930s failed. They did not
mm-hmm,
anticipate. So here's where democracy was a problem as far as meeting the emergency.
mm-hmm.
Congress, again, worried about another world war, looking back to World War One, trying to prevent taking the wrong lessons from history, as we always say, and applying them to their current circumstance. They couldn't anticipate what was about to happen. They couldn't see it coming in the way that FDR did. So FDR did everything he could within the constitutional system and got pretty creative with Lend-Lease and other ways of making sure that the British had what they needed in order to be able to keep the Nazis and repel Nazi invasion and keep the Germans at bay. So I think it's interesting. And then he goes on to say that in the 1960s, and the president fails. President shows he's fallible. So jumping ahead of the story, but it is interesting that both branches of government at some point show that they are fallible and that they can fail in terms of being able to lead, to anticipate the emergency. But again, it goes back to this whole balance of power between these branches that ensures liberty. So yes, so FDR anticipates what's coming. He does like the title of Commander in Chief. That really is a point where, because this is the greatest, since the Civil War anyway, the greatest national emergency that the commander, that the president had faced, and he's
Mm-hmm.
commanding more troops than anyone has ever commanded on every corner of the globe now. And so this is a period, and decisions have to be made. But he's gotten the declaration of war, the permission from Congress to move forward. So the idea, though, would be traditionally, the emergency's over with. 1945, emergency's over with. The Nazis and the Japanese are defeated, and now the president needs to relinquish those emergency powers, but it doesn't happen. Largely because, as Schlesinger points out, the rise of international communism, which happens almost immediately afterwards. And the great fear, the second Red Scare that we have in the 20th century, the great fear that we've just gotten through dealing with the Nazis and the Japanese. Now we've got the Russians and ultimately the Chinese and the North Koreans that we're going to have to deal with. And so communism is out there, and communism, there's a worldwide conspiracy, communist conspiracy, that ultimately what it wants to do is to destroy the West, to destroy free government, to destroy capitalism. And so now we've got an emergency that is an ongoing emergency that the president needs to deal with on a constant basis. And so that giving up of power that typically had happened after the emergency was over with, that's not going to happen after World War II because the emergency does not end.
And this is really when we begin to see the rise, particularly because, as you say, the threat is constant, the threat is ever present. Presidents say that they possess information no one else has. This is when we really begin to see something that people really complain so much about in the modern day, which is complete congressional deference to presidential judgment and presidential decisions. Decisions are made instead of Congress saying, "Wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen." It almost becomes second nature for the party of the president to immediately defer to him. But until recently, that was everybody. I wrote down two things here: national security, which led to secrecy. Which, boy, does Schlesinger talk about that. Everything can be hidden behind the need for executive secrecy and executive orders, right? Governing by executive fiat. That Eisenhower really took that to a different level, and the need to be less transparent about everything because of national security, and you can hide everything behind national security. Presidents have done that without fail, really, since Truman, to the point that you're talking about. I wanted to read this quote real quick from Schlesinger talking about Congress. He said, the presidency had not stolen its power, rather Congress had surrendered it out of fear of responsibility and recognition of incapacity. Congress was even without pride, and if ignored or disdained, waited humbly by the White House and licked the hand of its oppressor.
Yeah,
That could have been written yesterday.
that's a powerful quote.
Yes, yes. But
But
so
then
take
one,
yeah.
I
So
was
let's
going to say,
talk
but
about
then
this.
one could argue that maybe the Constitution and the way that it had been structured wasn't strong enough, wasn't suitable enough, didn't have the mechanism in place in order to meet this emergency.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he goes on to say, in fact, on that same page, institutionalized checks and balances might have been all right for an isolated nation of 4 million farmers 200 years ago. But had they not become first a nuisance and now a positive danger to a mighty industrial power destined to world leadership, presidential supremacy was the only salvation. Now, he's not saying he agrees that that was the mindset, that the world was too dangerous for all this checks and balances and these democratic excesses, and that presidents knew better than anybody that their primary goal and their primary job was to protect us from the dangers that all lurked from abroad, right? And so presidents begin seeing enemies everywhere too, particularly under Nixon, which we'll talk about. But this paranoid style of governing, right? The whole world's out to get us. And if you're president, the whole world's out to get me. The press is out to get me. Anybody who questions what I'm doing is out to get me, and it's undemocratic. This is where the beginning of all of this that we see.
And the commander in chief becomes this personification of this war power, the ability then to make decisions. And Truman becomes the first really to exercise that with the Korean War, which he calls a police action in
Mm-hmm.
order to justify what he's doing. And so he makes a decision to commit American troops and American ground forces and American air forces and sea power. All that is committed to defending South Korea from communist invasion. And of course, then MacArthur pushes it right up to the boundary of the Yalu River and into China. And that triggers the Chinese communist attack. Ultimately, we end up back basically status quo ante bellum, where you're back on the same position where you had been when all the fighting started. And that's really all that Truman wanted, because his definition of victory in a nuclear era was not total annihilation of the enemy, which is what MacArthur wanted, complete victory. But victory looked like preventing the world from blowing up. And
Mm-hmm.
so you just simply need to contain the communists, But that containment means somebody's got to be on that wall all the time. And I, as president, have information that you do not have, that you're not privy to. And this is also, as you pointed out earlier, this goes back to Washington. This whole idea that, well, what information do you have and what responsibility does Congress have to demand this so that the people know what's going on? Because if the people don't know what's going on in their government, they can't hold their leaders accountable, and that can be dangerous to liberty. So there's this ongoing tension, which the presidents expand, this ongoing tension between what is really secret and what is not,
Mm-hmm.
what will endanger the future of the United States and what will not. And some of that has to do also with, I think, the attitude of the president about whether or not he believes in a constitutional order or is paranoid like Nixon becomes, where enemies are everywhere out there.
Mm-hmm.
And Nixon's world becomes smaller and smaller. He listens to fewer and fewer voices, which leads to ultimately to disaster. Because in a democracy, the whole idea is that you have to listen to multiple voices because we all have a stake in this, and we're all not going to agree with each other about where things need to go and what victory looks like or what an outcome ought to be. So I think Schlesinger lays it out very nicely. You see the growth of this power as it goes on over time, but that no one man should hold that power of bringing the nation into war was a traditional concept from the beginning of the Republic. But maybe, I think the president certainly, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, maybe now that constitutional structure it just can't meet the emergencies of the 1950s and 60s and into the early 70s of
Mm-hmm.
worldwide communism. And I think the other thing I thought about as I was reading all this is that we certainly see that our government, like everything else, the structure of this, it is always constantly evolving. I think sometimes the public has this idea that, well, this is the way they set it up, and this is the way that it's always been. But it is constantly evolving, and power is flowing back and forth. And even as you and I are talking right now, everything is changing. We're changing. The world is changing. Government is changing. It's shaping. And we need to assume and be prepared. Just assume that the change is going to be there. And we need to not be surprised when it does happen. But that also means that however it may be right now, it's not going to continue to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is comforting. It should be to all of us as Americans that whatever it's set up, it's not going to be in stone that way.
And of course, what he's writing against too is Vietnam had been going on for a long time at that point. It eventually, we know, claimed 58,000 American lives. And the whole idea was that at no point had the people's representatives in Congress ever approved this war, had never declared there's no declaration of war for the Vietnam War. And that going forward, the presidents could involve the United States and its military in these long, long undeclared wars that drained us of manpower and resources and cost all this blood and treasure. And not to mention, he's also writing about the Central Intelligence Agency, which comes out of the Cold War. Congress sets it up, but also sets it up in such a way that the CIA is never answerable to anybody. And they, of course, go out themselves. And there's clandestine operations that are carried on in places all around the world. No one really knows what they're doing. They're not answerable to anybody. So you get what Eisenhower called, right, this military industrial complex, the national security state, that in and of itself seems to be impervious to accountability. And that is what has created the imperial presidency that, quite frankly, we live with to this day. Presidents feeling as if they are not accountable or answerable, and this goes across the grain of all parties. When presidents are in power, they know things the rest of the people don't know. And there's this long precedent that now goes back 80 years, right, of having
Well, and
this
I think
power.
this is, I think, sort of the point that he's trying to make about how that then affects domestic policy, domestic politics, because Nixon is that first president to really use impoundment And he uses it in a
Yes.
different way than previous presidents had used it for economic or financial reasons. Nixon now is using it for political reasons, and he's using impoundment not as a way to check budgets that are out of control, but he uses it as a way to set the national agenda. So, in other words, he's taken the national agenda away from Congress.
Now, what is
Which,
impoundment? Let's stop real quick and say, and tell our listeners what that is. We've seen
well,
it in our own day.
impoundment is the idea that Congress may have appropriated money for a particular program or project, but then the president decides, well, you know what? I don't think we ought to spend money on that. And he therefore refuses to spend the money. And so whatever that project is, it dies a borning. It just never happens.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been presidents who had done this in the past, but it was because there were financial crises, or maybe the budget was out of control. But Nixon uses it in a way that basically says, I, the imperial president, I'm going to set the national agenda now, not Congress. And that traditionally had been the role of Congress. This going back again to the idea that Congress said, we represent the people. And so therefore we have the power of the purse, and we have the power to decide what the laws are. We have the power to set the agenda. The president's job is to carry that out,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And that's part of his oath, which is why Lincoln got into the to fighting against secessionists, because he said, I have to carry out my oath. I have to make sure the laws are being faithfully executed in South Carolina, for instance. And if you're obstructing that, that's going to lead us into a conflict. So Nixon has basically he's usurped that power. And this goes back to what Schlesinger was talking about with the idea that if the president can exercise these kinds of powers to unilaterally decide where there's an emergency and where troops need to be committed and where war needs to be waged, then he will eventually usurp that power domestically and will usurp unto himself, will arrogate unto himself the power to determine what the national agenda is. And so
Mm-hmm.
now you really are creating this imperial presidency.
One of the other things that happens during the Nixon presidency, and Schlesinger sees this as being very, very dangerous. And I don't know if after 50 years we would see this differently. When I talked to Corey Shockey about the civilian military relationship in our history, she interpreted this very differently. But one of the things Schlesinger says that's also happening under the Nixon presidency is the move toward an all volunteer army. And he sees that as being dangerous to democracy because suddenly the sacrifice and the risk of serving in the military is now going to be among basically one class of people. And the middle class is not going to be invested in these military operations and adventures across the world. And it really gives the president it's his own military fighting force, if you will. It doesn't belong to the United States anymore. It belongs to him. After 50 years, I don't know if that's held up or it hasn't in terms of whether or not that has turned out to be the case, or if, in fact, I know that Corey Shockey said the military now says that the country doesn't go to war, the military does, because we can just sort of go on about our business these days when we're fighting a war, unless it touches us in some way, that we don't feel it the way the American people felt the Vietnam War because of the draft. What's your take on that?
Well, I think Schlesinger addresses that when basically he makes the point that when the president is able to commit troops anywhere in the world, he's treating it like it's his personal property.
Mm-hmm.
When you're able to do this without any congressional authorization, in other words, without the permission of the people of the United States, then you're treating this as your own personal property. And I think the argument that you're describing here is that, but if you have a draft army and military force, I mean, because the draft affects also the other branches, but if
Mm-hmm.
you have a draft force, an armed force created of draftees, that Congress is still going to be in charge. And you're going to have that spread across much more evenly throughout society as well. But when you have an all volunteer force, you're basically drawing on only one segment of society for the most part. And now the president can begin to commit that force And eventually, not only does he see that force as his, but that military becomes disassociated from the wider public. You've got this standing army, which was also something that the colonists and the founders have feared, because this was all part, again, going the war-making power of a king, because it becomes basically their Praetorian Guard, and it becomes the president's instrument that he can use abroad. He could also then begin to use it at home. And then I think the larger argument, the way that it goes, is eventually this Praetorian Guard, this army that's made up of simply of volunteers and only from one segment of society, it will then determine who the president will be. This is the road you're going down, the road towards a military coup, where, and this is what happened in the latter part of the Roman Empire, where the Praetorian Guard said, well, we're going to choose who the rulers are. And they would kill the emperor if they felt the emperor wasn't performing his duties. And they had taken that power into themselves. So that is, I think, the argument is that that's the larger issue that's here, and the larger danger to our liberties as Americans is that when the president has this power to decide and to commit troops anywhere, and he's got an all-volunteer force that is not spread across society, and is disassociated from Congress in many ways, then ultimately that military can be used against the American people.
Mm-hmm.
And also to remove presidents.
Mm-hmm. Shifting gears slightly, one of the other things that Schlesinger talks about is something called the plebiscitary presidency,
presidency.
which is all about a plebiscite, which is when something goes to the people and they vote on it, which a president can argue all the way back to Jackson that the president is the only person who is elected by all of the people. Senators are elected by all the people of their state. Representatives are elected by the people in their district, which can be tiny. But the president, so the saying goes, are elected by everybody. And I want to read this. Nixon was carrying the imperial presidency toward its ultimate form in the plebiscitary presidency, with the president accountable only once every 4 years, shielded in the years between elections from congressional and public harassment, empowered by his mandate to make war or to make peace, to spend or to impound, to give out information or to hold it back, superseding congressional legislation by executive order, all in the name of a majority whose choice must prevail till it made another choice 4 years later, unless it wished to embark on the drastic and improbable course of impeachment. Here at last was the, quote, elective kingship that Henry Jones Ford had foreseen 75 years earlier. So I think Johnson also felt that, right? In 1964, some people, historians, have said when a president wins in the kind of overwhelming landslide that LBJ did, it's really bad for the country because of hubris, because they say, the people are with me. They put me here and I can do virtually anything. He took it, of course, as not only a mandate to get the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act done, which those things are there, but also, of course, the military decisions that he made. And he didn't run in 1968. He chose not to. And so in part, he could focus on the Vietnam War. But the idea that the president alone is elected by all of the people and therefore really is an elected king.
So you have the plebiscite, which is, and you select the president, and then the people have the power to do that. But because of these emergencies that are ongoing, you need to step aside and let the president make these decisions and to handle this, and to do what the president needs to do between these elections. Your power will be in two ways. You'll either be able to elect or re-elect or elect a new president in 4 years, or you can impeach the president. So, but in between that time, the president has been elected by the people. The president gets to do what the president wants to do in order to carry out the will of the people. Now, it's interesting that Johnson he decides not to run again because, like we had said earlier, he's got an eye on the people. Just like Schlesinger said about FDR, he didn't want to go there alone. He knew where the country wanted to go. He didn't want to go alone. And that's what made him a great president, according to Schlesinger. And so I think the same thing applies here with LBJ. He didn't want to go there alone and knew that he would lose. But this is ultimately, according to Schlesinger, where this is going to lead. And that if this constitutional order that and structure that had been created in 1787 to 1789 when it was ratified, that at that point now we've moved this beyond that traditional constitutional order. We're now going to have an order that allows us in the modern era to deal with modern problems. And of course, the part of what is troubling about that is what happens in between those 4-year periods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the whole idea of governing by executive order rather than going to Congress, that is the people, and trying to sell your ideas to the people, whatever they are, and getting the representatives to go along with you.
Right, because then at that point, Congress, there really is nothing for Congress to do.
So one of the things that we also touch on, particularly as this program is part of our US 250 programming, you and I are talking about this book because it's essentially talking about the history of the American presidency and how from Washington all the way to the present. And one of the things that we keep hearing in this US 250 year is that the founding fathers chose republics in part because they were counting on Americans being virtuous, to use their phrase, that an educated people would always choose good leaders because the American people themselves would be virtuous. Now, I want to read a quote by Walter Lippmann, who was, of course, a famous 20th century newspaper editorialist. Watergate, he said, this was during 1972, I think, or 73, shows how very vulnerable our constitutional system is. If the national government falls into the hands of sufficiently unprincipled and unscrupulous men, they can do terrible things before anyone can stop them. And in the review of this book, The Imperial Presidency, in 1973, Gary Wills, who was a young historian at that time, who had written already in 1970 a book about Richard Nixon, said this, and I want to quote from his review: "The founders of this nation worried about the machinery of government." What he says is that Schlesinger makes the argument that when we get bad presidents, there's something wrong with the Constitution and we need to tinker with it. We need to fix it. There's something in there. There's a mechanism, whether it's the Electoral College, whatever it is. Wills says, and I quote here, "The founders of this nation worried about the machinery of government, but also about the virtue of the people. The Constitution allows for self-government without guaranteeing any virtue in the electorate. Modern liberals assume a virtue in the people if only people are allowed to speak. Every fault in government is derived, therefore, from some obstacle that baffled voters' expression of their will." But Nixon was the expression of that will. If he is a blight, it is because there has been a failure of virtue in those who express their wishes. And he goes on to say, basically, that everybody knew in 1968 who Richard Nixon was. They knew his faults. They knew his failures because he had run for president in 1960 against Kennedy. He had been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. Tricky Dick was the nickname, right? That everybody knew who he was, that he was a little bit shady, that he was paranoid, all of these things, that he was he did not like Eastern establishment elites, as he called them, the nattering nabobs of negativity, as his vice president Spiro Agnew called the press. And essentially, Gary Wills says in 1972, when he went in for the election, there really was no secret of who Nixon, and yet the people chose him. The people chose Nixon. So the fault, he says, is not in the Constitution, but we have arrived at a place where the American people are getting exactly what they want.
Well, it's an interesting argument, and also what it brings up is the idea that when people are afraid and they live in times of fear, they are willing to trade their liberty for security. And so,
or what they perceive as security.
Yeah, what they perceive as security. And I think in this particular case, what's happening in the 60s, I mean, we have to remember that it was like the American society was like an anthill that had been kicked, and everything was turned up on its head. and it was chaos, and there were multiple assassinations, and Vietnam, and a sexual revolution, a civil rights revolution, a revolution in race, and Nixon looks like
Multiple
he's got
assassinations. Yeah.
multiple assassinations of top, I mean, presidents, of Dr. King,
Presidential
young
candidates,
presidential
RFK.
candidates, yeah. And so there is this sense that order must be restored. And so you may know what someone looks like, but you're also voting because you know that you feel like that order is necessary.
Hmm.
And I think that that's what that raises, is that the system of democracy itself is not perfect. It may be the argument is that it's the best system, but it's still flawed. It is still a human system, and there are certainly going to be errors within it. The question is, will the people eventually exert their power, remember the virtues, and then bring their government to heel and ensure that the government that they're getting really does reflect who they are and what they want. And this whole idea of virtue is a two-way street because it's not just the people, but we also have to have the founders and certainly the ancient Romans and Greeks believed that a republic would not survive if the leaders were not virtuous. So this is an idea that a virtuous leader always puts the public good, the commonwealth, ahead of their personal gain. And that the people needed to choose leaders like George Washington that they knew they could trust with power, that would do the right thing, and that would put the the common good and the good of the people in the country ahead of their own personal ambition and their own personal gain. So the virtue is a two-way street. It's not just the people, but then also the leaders have to exercise and demonstrate virtue as well.
And Schlesinger makes clear he's in favor of a strong president, particularly in the domestic sphere. But he sort of agrees with Wills, even in his own book. He says a constitutional presidency, as the great presidents have shown, could be a very strong presidency indeed. But what kept a strong president constitutional, in addition to checks and balances incorporated within his own breast, was the vigilance of the nation. Neither impeachment nor repentance would make much difference if the people themselves had come to an unconscious acceptance of the imperial presidency. The Constitution could not hold the nation to ideals it was determined to betray.
Well, doesn't that go back to the 18th century concept that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the people needed to be on guard and not to become apathetic or complacent, but they needed to be on guard to constantly be watching for usurpation of power, would-be tyrants, people who would accrue unto themselves power that the constitutional system did not grant to them. And so, I mean, remember that when Jefferson got up and argued for a public school system and the bill in Virginia, one of the things he focused on was the teaching of history. And he said, particularly the teaching of the history of tyranny. Because he said, I think our public, the people, young people, as they grow up and eventually become citizens and vote in the republic, they need to be able to identify a would-be tyrant. They need to know that history of the past where tyrants have seized power so that they can see it when it's going on and nip it in the bud and bring those people to heel. So the constitutional order has to function. Each branch has got to perform and has to be jealous of its prerogatives. So much of what happened, there were people who certainly sympathized with Nixon during that time period, but people in his own party. But they also they understood the constitutional order, and they were jealous of the prerogative that Congress and its power, and jealous of that congressional power, that they would maintain that power. So I think that's the trick. The question is, and Schlesinger addresses this, is can the system work? And it can work, yes, and we can have a strong president, But the other branches have got to exert their power as well and to be jealous of their prerogatives.
As we near the end here, the other thing I want to point out, near the end of almost on the last page, Arthur Schlesinger's father, that I introduced our listeners to at the beginning, he was also a historian. One of his great theses was the cycles of American history. In fact, Arthur Jr. wrote a book in 1986 by that title. Yeah. So the cycles of American history would repeat themselves. And so Schlesinger, near the end of his book, says, we've noted that corruption appears to visit the White House in 50-year cycles, because he talks about 1873 during the Grant administration, 1923 during the Harding administration with the Teapot Dome scandal, 1973 with Watergate. And he says, around the year 2023, the American people would be well advised to go on the alert and start nailing down everything in sight. And I think we can leave that right there with no comment other than to say 50 years from now, we'll let the two people sitting in our positions talk about whatever technology is available to them, how prescient or not that prediction was when he made it. Any final thoughts about the Imperial Presidency and what it has to say to us?
Well, just to pick up on what you were saying as you close that, it is interesting that these major anniversaries that we commemorate and mark and celebrate in American history have come with those 50-year cycles of a surge in the Imperial Presidency, a surge in power, whether it's the 50th, the 100th. I mean, as you go throughout and you look back across American history, you can see that these things happen during times in the past when there has been periods of corruption and a usurpation of power. And it's really fascinating.
The book is called The Imperial Presidency by Arthur Schlesinger. It was published in 1973. It was reissued in 1989 and again in 2003 or 4. I can't remember, but I already said that in my introduction. So it's widely available out there. I should note that you and I read the 1973 version as it was in its original. And hopefully we will do this again with another book. Todd Groce, thanks for coming on here and sharing your thoughts.
Stan, it's been fun. Thank you for having me.
My thanks to Todd Groce for joining me on this podcast. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including Podchaser, YouTube and YouTube Music, Spotify, and of course the podcast app on your phone. Wherever you listen or find it, please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Deaton Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every Off the Deaton Path podcast, blog, and video that I've ever created at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.